As John said, Victoria is not here, but I'm going to introduce the rest of the panelists. We have Isabel Anandan, Assistant Professor of Sociology at University of Buffalo, State University of New York. Sarah Ungander, Undergraduate Research Scholar, Justice Policy Lab at the Watson Institute here at Brown University. Caitlin Sims, Assistant Professor of Microeconomics and Public Policy at the University of Denver. Sam Theo Harris, also undergraduate student and scholar at the Justice Policy Lab, Watson Institute, Brown University. And I am Heather Schoenfeld, Associate Professor of Sociology at Boston University. So I'm really looking forward to this panel, and thank you, John, for bringing us all together.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that introduction. Heather, my name is Kate Sims. I think I have the distinction of being one of the only economists in the room, so please forgive me in advance for that. Additionally, please forgive me for not being our lovely Victoria. We are going to make sure that we are able to cover the same material as in general, because it doesn't necessarily make sense to start talking about the prison bust without having first set the stage for the prison boom. So we will go ahead and kind of get started by thinking about this, looking at the dramatic rise in the number of prisons that we've seen over the last couple of decades, thinking about mass incarceration trends. This is probably familiar to a lot of folks in the room, but one of the things that brought most of us, many of us, I don't know, a good chunk of us together is the data with which we're able to really think about how to quantify this and how to think about it critically. Oop. There we go. All right, so when we start talking about the prison boom, we need to first think about its roots, right? And how has this reshaped the landscape of incarceration over the last several decades? So since the year 1970-ish, in the last couple decades of the 20th century, there was an unprecedented increase in prison construction, talking about a scale that I feel like many of us think about abstractly, but to put it concretely, growing from over 500 facilities in the 1960s to over 1,700 by where we are now. And this is going to be marking the beginning of what we think of as mass incarceration, this phenomenon where the US incarcerates more individuals per capita than any country in the world. A lot of folks have this idea that this surge in prison construction was driven by corporate interests specifically seeking profit, so kind of in the driver's seat. And we want to kind of push back against this and think about it a little bit more in context of what the role of the state is. So we can think about Alabama as one specific case of this. Alabama has recently decided to invest over $1 billion in constructing supersized prisons. And this highlights the complexity of the ongoing nature of prison expansion, something that is in fact related very strongly to corporate private profits, but where the state is an active player. So when we start thinking about incarceration rates over time, we have this lovely graph from one of the papers that the lab has produced, comparing our logged change in prison population from 1980 to 2010 on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, the number of new prisons over the same time period. So we see that there was a dramatic increase in incarceration rates from approximately 198 per 100,000 US adults to 670 per 100,000. And this reflects the domestic trend of mass incarceration, but also places the US at the forefront globally, right? So peaking at about 743 persons per 100,000 incarcerated in 2018. We see that this is not a Southern phenomenon, but something where the South is in fact a key contributor to the trend, both in terms of prison construction and incarceration rates that outpace the national average. There has been a noticeable slowdown in new prisons post-2000, but incarceration rates, COVID excluded, COVID being a very weird thing that I'm sure we'll have lots of thoughts about, but despite that, we saw incarceration rates that remained very, very high and disproportionately high in the US. And this suggests that the US's approach to incarceration is indeed an outlier, right? And this justifies a deeper examination of these policies and practices that have driven this trend. So I apologize for the tables. The numbers get really tiny. I'll walk us through what we need to know. So here we're going to present state averages of all variables included for our analysis. We're thinking about this in terms of all states and southern states from 1980 to 2010. So if you notice up here at the top, we have all states and then south, all south for different decades. So looking over this 30-year span of data, we are able to see a pronounced rise from 198 per 100,000 people adult incarcerated in 1980 to 670 by 2010 in all states. But in the South, we saw this surge peaking at 889 adults. So a very large gap created in the South compared to the national average. Carceral capacity also has a notable increase in the South, which went from housing 7 prisons to 38 by 2010. And there's a strong drive towards building infrastructure for imprisonment. One of the things that the lab is really interested in that John really drives us into thinking about is causes and consequences, right? How can we think about what things have generated this boom, and then what has the boom generated in turn? So when we're thinking about the places that are experiencing this prison boom, we can compare income inequality, land, and labor, and we observe that there's been this increase over time, suggesting that perhaps increasing or growing economic disparity is paralleling this trend of increased incarceration. The poverty rate has fluctuated, and in fact, in 2010, it slightly decreased, which could imply that there has been perhaps a more complicated relationship between economic welfare and incarceration rates. And so in summary, we see that this prison boom is going to be multifactorial, right? There's economic conditions and racial demographics and a push for more carceral spaces all playing a role. And these insights are going to kind of drive the work that the lab is continuing to do going forward. So we look state by state. This is going to compare 2 states in our data set, California and Oklahoma, showing state averages in those different decades. One of the things that we often talk about is while we can perhaps generalize and say the prison boom, there are actually different patterns. And this is something that we're going to talk about more explicitly once we get into the prison bust section of today's talk. And so California and Oklahoma are 2 prime examples of kind of these different narratives of the prison boom's scale and impact. So California expanded its facilities from 3 to 40, and Oklahoma from 14 to 47. So both had aggressive growth in carceral infrastructure. And in the South, we saw that this was not isolated to Oklahoma. There's not one single state that's driving the bus here. We see this in Texas, Florida, Ohio, New York, Georgia, all adding things in. And so there's this uneven landscape of prison construction. This is not a national phenomenon. This is a repeated state-level phenomenon, a repeated local-level phenomenon that we think is worth study. When we think about operational capacity at the state level, we want to think about what does it actually look like inside of these facilities, right? How are states thinking about operational capacity? Are they operating over capacity and with chronic overcrowding? Are they managing below it? Because we think that this connects really strongly to the different policies that are at play. So here, again, we've got California and Oklahoma, and we notice that the overcrowding balance, so the operational capacity, overcrowding over time kind of varies in different states, with a rapid increase in operational capacity in some states representing the overall prison boom, but especially in the South. But we also think of the operational capacity as more than just a measure of space or bed spaces, right? This is a barometer for the state's approach to criminal legal system and criminal justice more broadly. And we want to think about this from the perspective of a prison capacity management, so showing that certain states are overcrowded, but certain states are not, right? So if we are going to believe that racism and profit-making motives are driving imprisonment, where prisons are an afterthought, we absolutely might want to kind of flip that thing and think about how are prisons actually an intentional part of this puzzle. So next, we are going to link prisons and incarceration rates. So thinking about here are the places that have been built. How are they being filled? This is a state-level fixed effects estimate of the effect of the cumulative number of prisons built since 1970 on state incarceration rates 2 years later. This is something that we spend a lot of time in our papers talking about, is what is the appropriate lag? How long do we think things are taking to build? So if you have thoughts, I would love to hear them as the resident statistics nerd on the team. So when we're looking here, we see that incarceration rates are preceding construction with incarceration as a response. An additional prison is associated with an increase in the incarceration rate, emphasizing the impact of carceral capacity on trends. And we see this as being a complicated relationship between increasing crime rates and prison spaces. So our findings suggest that the construction of prisons often precede rises in incarceration rates, indicating a supply-driven model of carceral expansion. We see this especially in the South, where aggressive prison building has paralleled high incarceration rates. So what do we do with all of this information? What do we take away from it? And then more importantly for the researchers in the room, where are we going next, right? What is the plan for future research with this? So we have to understand the demand for prisons in rural town, recognizing the role of economic incentives and the need for local development. This is not a story of needing bed spaces because of crime rates. This is a story of a complicated tapestry of public policy making, of which prison construction is one key piece. This is going to pave the way for understanding our comprehensive policy recommendations that tackle the root causes of incarceration, from enhancing social services to promoting economic opportunities in vulnerable communities. Because fundamentally, we believe that if you want to redo the carceral system, you have to start by giving rural communities better options. So as we start to consider the responsible closure of prisons or responsible decarceration, alternatives to incarceration become vital for this. So this could be things like thinking about programs for drug treatment and community service that are viable options for reducing the prison population sustainably, and the repurposing of closed prison facilities, which offers a unique opportunity to support local development initiatives without relying on incarceration as an economic engine. I believe we're just going to go next into it. Okay, we are now at my slides, so I will be stepping back. Thank you. Thank you, Victoria, in absentia, for wonderful notes from which I read. Okay, so we are here to talk about the prison bust now. We've set the stage for the prison boom, kind of this expansion, but has this continued? We're going to argue no. We is a pretty decently sized team in the lab, including Isabel, Victoria, Lewis, Jacob, who are both not here, as well as Eason, Chloe. Yes, I'm like walking through the byline in my head. There was a big group of us, a large Zoom call often. So we wanted to ask the question of, okay, the prison boom has been well documented. We've seen this in a lot of places. Has this been something that's continued? And if not, what are perhaps the theoretical reasons for this? So using data that we have collected, we being largely the efforts of Victoria, Lewis, and Jacob, have the first comprehensive record of prison closures between 2000 and 2022. This is the universe of secure confinement state and federal prisons. So it's 188 closures. The economist in me is like, oh, it's not a large number, but it's a pretty large number. And we're able to run some really interesting regression analysis on this, especially compared to the number of facilities in general. These data were collected via public records requests, as well as prison census data and news reports, lots and lots of FOIA-ing. And it's going to represent the elimination of over 128,000 prison beds in the United States. So this is a 9% decrease in carceral capacity, or a 16% decrease in the total number of secure confinement prison facilities, which was one of our initial questions in motivating this. Is this just reorganizing the state of incarceration, perhaps putting more folks into fewer facilities, but we actually see, in general, a decrease in beds. So we, in this paper, which was published November, I believe, in Punishment in Society, provide the first evidence of a prison bust beginning in the year 2000, peaking in the year 2008. So here I have a wonderful figure of prison openings in gray, prison closures in black. You may notice that the black line does not continue into the past. That's because our data start in 2000. Nothing funky there. So we see that this provides strong evidence. Do we have a laser? Oh, amazing. So this is going to provide strong evidence of what we talked about earlier, this prison boom, right? We see starting in 1960, things have been really flat. Starting in the 70s, they peak up, they peak up, they peak up, and then they really are just increasing with 60 new facilities in a year. But it starts to move down, right? So by the time we stop talking about our data, we generally are looking at around 2010, by which point the prison bust is starting. So the number of closures is relatively consistent until we hit 2008. You might remember there were some things that happened in 2008, 2009. It was a weird time for financial precarity in the public sector. So that gives us a sense, like at scale, if across the US, how many closures are we talking about? Here is going to be a map of openings of prisons across space and time. You might notice a couple of interesting trends there. Some things that I take away from this map are we have a lot in California, not a surprise to many of us in the room. but definitely representative of kind of what we've talked about with carceral capacity, as well as other big players. We've got Texas, we've got Florida. I'm not going to embarrass myself with my geography by pointing out other states, but a lot happening over here on this eastern seaboard. Still a good amount happening kind of in a little bit more open space in more of the Midwest, Front Range region. But we're seeing a capacity expansion that is the equivalent of over 860,000 additional prison beds over a 30-year period. Here I have the closures. So we'll just do a real quick little flip. You might notice that the closures are also clustered, but in interesting ways, right? So we have some closures here in California and Washington State, a few out here in the middle and in Texas, but largely when we're thinking about closures, we're thinking about things that are happening on the eastern seaboard, little in Michigan outside of like Illinois, and a little in the Midwest, outside of Michigan and Illinois. But this decrease is also substantial, right? We're also talking about 129,000 fewer beds over a 20-year period. So one of the things that we do in our analysis is we're going to compare characteristics of closed facilities. So we're looking over here with our N of 188 facilities that close between 2000 and 2022. And here we're going to look at different characteristics of these facilities. So what is happening in terms of custody level, the sex of incarcerated persons there, et cetera. We see that there's pretty decent variation actually in the level of custody. I mean, half of them are going to be in these minimum security facilities. Their median capacity is about 500. Most of the facilities that are closing are male facilities, just probably a reflection of most facilities being male facilities. There has been a substantial increase in the number of incarceration facilities that are incarcerating women, but generally speaking, we're seeing more male facilities closing. But one of the things that kind of, I don't want to say blew our minds, we had a working hypothesis, but it was nice to validate that working hypothesis, is that overwhelmingly 57% of these counties that closed a facility have another facility in the same county, right? So this is not the story of carceral capacity disappearing in these places, but instead transition or moving of carceral capacity outside of those places. And then again, kind of coming to what we were talking about earlier in terms of private versus state, 90% of the organizations that, or of the facilities that closed were state operated, 5% federal, and the remaining private. So again, this is a story of state budgets, state policy making, state strategizing that we really want to think about. So why are prisons closing? We're going to argue, and we do argue in the paper, that prison closures are largely located in places where prison construction was used as an economic lever for local governments, right? So this is not the story of prisons being opened in response to the crime rate, but rather what we were talking about earlier as prisons being opened as a tool used by local governments. We saw local governments bid competitively for prisons during the boom. There are all sorts of anecdotes that people will tell you about different states that were basically engaging in a race to the bottom effect, trying to come up with the most attractive package that they could present to state authorities in order to get those prisons placed there, rather than prisons being developed in response to local demand for bed space. Over half of closures occurred in counties with more than one prisons, and these closures are really concentrated by states. So a third of closures are in 3 U.S. states, New York, North Carolina, and Texas. So when we compare closures in counties with closures to counties with prisons but no closures, we see that closure counties are twice as large in population, they're less likely to be rural, they're richer, they're more likely to vote Democratic. And so we've seen that to date, closures have occurred in regions that are better suited to cope with the potential socioeconomic fallout of a prison closure. A lot of us in the room, as we start talking about, smart decarceration or responsible decarceration, are really worried about what's going to happen to these local facilities that don't represent this half where there is another prison in the county. But what's happening when the prison is a large major employer in a relatively rural space? So here is just going to be a table that will represent the facts that I just told you. Again, comparing counties with prisons but no closures, or counties with prisons but closures. And again, showing that the closures that we've observed, the things that we can take lessons from, are not necessarily the counties that we're really worried about when we talk about what is the economic fallout going to be of decarceration or prison closure. So what are our takeaways? Kind of what do we do with this information? We see that the prison bust is most present in regions with aggressive prison building policies during the boom. So this is places that were very cyclical and reactionary to the potential for economic development as a result of prison construction that are now closing this, right? So cyclical and reactionary means cyclical and reactionary, and we're kind of seeing the other side of that cycle. We've seen that prison closures have been largely driven by instrumental motives, things like budget reduction, staffing shortages, and a surplus of carceral capacity, meaning that we don't necessarily need 2 prisons in the same county, right? So we argue that this means the prison bust should be thought of as a restructuring of the carceral state rather than a decarceration abolitionist outcome. And the prison bust has mostly occurred outside of these traditional prison towns, which means that we can try to learn things from these closures, but it's also really important to think about what we can't learn from these closures when we're trying to think about more generalized prison town rural places. And that is all I have for you. I will go ahead and turn it over to our wonderful undergraduates, Sarah Ogundare and Sam Theo Harris. Let me get this out of your way. Oh, thank you.
Hi, everyone. Such a pleasure to be speaking today. I'm Sarah, this is Sam, and we're undergraduate research scholars with Professor Eason here at Brown. We're going to be talking about a couple of case studies that we've done research on as part of his prison abolitionist policy class and as part of the lab. Yeah, I'll pass it over to you to start.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, so one of the things that we've highlighted in the lab and that Professor Eason has highlighted in his first book is that largely the reasons that prisons get built, particularly in these rural places, in these rural prison towns that we often think of when we think about prison towns, is because there's demand for them. So prisons are public works projects. They're often stigmatized public works projects, but they are public works projects. So they often get they're often responded to initially with the classic "not in my backyard" NIMBY sort of response, where people are might want the aspects of a public works project, but don't want it to be so close to them. They don't want it to have particular effects. But this is some particular cases in which people do end up wanting prisons, and so that often coincides with towns that have had some sort of social stigmatization in terms of some sort of large event where they have a poor reputation. This also can increase the need economic opportunity, some sort of social stability, and prisons are also a great source of government funding, both directly in terms of the money going into the prison and then indirectly in terms of money going into healthcare infrastructure and education. So when all of these come together in a perfect storm in these rural towns, people tend to move from this more NIMBY attitude to a PIMBY attitude, or a please in my backyard. So what this means for responsible decarceration or abolitionist policy is that we need to be curbing demand before we can be getting rid of these prisons. We need to be curbing demand for the prisons and filling the both social, political, and economic footprint that they leave behind.
I really like this clicker. Right? Yeah, I really like it. So to situate this in a couple of case studies, our class specifically looked at the prison bust in California. And so this means not just doing research on our own, archival work, looking through news reports, but also interviewing members of these communities. So we studied the ways that prison closures in California sort of began in 2021 as part of this campaign, this progressive campaign. And we specifically looked at Susanville and Blythe as 2 communities that when their prison closure was announced, because it was announced, it was not something that they had community input in. When it was announced, it came as a shock and a lot of outrage because the prison supports a decent number of jobs in those towns. I have a couple of statistics up on there from reports in these towns. And so with this loss of economic opportunity, of course, they're given their reliance on the prison over so much time, they reacted with outrage. And so when we spoke to them, and had interviews with various members of the community, it reflected that. A lot of people talked about how the prison drives the community, and it's seen as one of the most reliable sources of economic improvement. So that means not just bringing in jobs and government money, as Sam alluded to, and yeah, for example, jobs as correctional officers, but also impacts schools, hospitals, housing. People talked about how family members might move to their communities if a loved one is incarcerated in a facility that's in their town. They talked about how their towns get additional funding in terms of schools and hospitals because incarcerated people might be enrolled in a program in the school or might be treated by the hospital, and that allows them to further fund programs that also benefit their residents. And at the same time, an interesting fact that we learned from the community of Blythe specifically was that it also sort of reproduces a level of social stratification when correctional officers are employed because of how reliable those jobs are. They're seen as like a social. They have an elevated social status compared to others in the town, which was really interesting. But overall, one of the main things that we heard from residents of this town is that with the prison arrival, which had been advertised to them as a source of economic benefit to them, it led to the decline of other alternative profitable businesses like agriculture in Susanville, which led to increased reliance on the prison, and which also contextualizes this shift from NIMBY to PIMBY. As they're becoming more reliant and they have less other forms of economic development, they have more need for the prison.
Yeah, so we even see that this trend from NIMBY to PIMBY gets extended a bit further into LIMBY, into a leave it in my backyard. As we start to see these prison closures, we've seen an uprising of community organizations and community coalitions that have come together in these prison towns to fight the state to keep their prison because it is such a vital portion of the social, political, and economic landscapes of the town. The people that are in these movements feel, and the data suggests that they're correct, that removing the prisons would leave the town almost entirely destitute. And so that's why we've worked, when we were working with Blythe and with Susanville, we did a lot of interviewing and talking to residents about both the Save Chuck campaign and the Save CCC campaign in Blythe and Susanville, respectively.
Right, and I'll just mention also briefly, when I was taking Professor Eason's class, one thing I did not expect were campaigns around saving the prison and advocacy, self-advocacy around the prison. So that was something that I definitely learned because it was coming at it from an angle that I didn't expect. And one of the things that we talked about in class, I remember interviewing when we were doing research with Susanville, a superintendent of one of the schools, is the effect of the prison closure on those schools, and sort of flipping the discourse around the school to prison pipeline on its head and thinking about the prison closure to rural school closure pipeline. So I have a couple of quotes up here from our interviews with Blythe, and I think one on the next slide from Susanville. I won't read them for the sake of time, but they do focus on how the school district relies on an incarcerated population as students in order to get further income, and how within the schools, students, especially I remember in the high school, they talked about how they saw the pathway of becoming a correctional officer as one of the most reliable ways of being employed after only needing a high school diploma. And I guess the desperation that a lot of these community members feel is, I think, articulated by the last, how does this work? There we go. This last sentence: we don't have a community anymore if all of these institutions that we've relied upon begin to close as a result. And yeah, again, in Susanville, they have the sense that everything is going to suffer if they have less funding going to schools, less students in the classroom, less programs available, less pathways to dependable employment for students, and ultimately school closure is their fear as well.
Well, if Kate is our statistics nerd in residence, I'm our statistics nerd in training here at the Justice Policy Lab. So I'm going to talk through a little bit of the quantitative methods and how we conceptualize our study of prison towns and their effects on schools. So first of all, we use a sort of an uncommon unit of geography when we're analyzing prison towns. We use the census place, which, for those of you familiar with census data, is a wholly unwieldy unit of analysis because it only merges well with states and the census blocks. Anything else doesn't play nicely with. But as we can see here, it's really good at getting a precise picture of what these prison towns look like. So this is this bottom line. Whoops, I turned it off. There we go. This bottom line here is Blythe. So this is just talking about median household income as a proxy, right? So this bottom line is Blythe. This line is the county it resides in, Riverside County. This is the whole state of California, and this is the U.S. And so what you can see here is that the place of Blythe operates as an economic unit that while it does tend to follow the trends of the county, state, and country, it tends to lag behind at many different points. It is trending in the opposite direction as all these other things. So this is really, I think, a very succinct example of why place is really the unit of analysis we should be using. Now, the unfortunate part about this is it doesn't jive well with districts. So I'm going to walk through a little bit of how we're thinking moving forward as we begin to start our formal analysis on the effects on school districts. So this is North Carolina. We're going to look at North Carolina because, as Kate mentioned, it is one of the 3 biggest states that has the most closures, along with New York and Texas. And so this is the map of all the school districts in North Carolina. And here are all of the census places. So as you can see, they don't all line up very well. There are census places that do fall completely within districts, and there are census places that fall just at the edge. There are census places that come over the borders. There's a lot of North Carolina that doesn't fall within census places. So this leaves us with an issue of how do we reconcile this? And just to also add in there, those black dots, they're a little bit hard to see, my apologies. Those are where all of the prisons are in North Carolina. So our working solution to this problem right now is to create service areas. So service areas use the road networks and drive times to map out a 20 and 25 minute driving radius from each of the prisons. And so when we do that, it looks like this. And so each of those, the inner ring is a 20-minute drive, and the outer ring, a little bit hard to tell the difference, is a 25-minute drive. And so our reasoning for this is that any school district that is within a 25-minute drive of a prison is at least reasonably likely to be affected by that prison's closure because it's a close enough radius where if people work at the prison, they may also have children that go to the school, or they may have a spouse that works at the school, etc. And so what we can do then is grab any school district that overlaps with these 20 and 25-minute radii to get our study areas. And so when we do that, this is what it looks like. So this is what it looks like with all of the prisons. Now, there are a couple of school districts that don't visually make a whole lot of sense that they should be included in this. And we're working on refining this method some so that may change. But even if we do include these, that will, if anything, give us a conservative estimate of the impacts of prison closures on schools and school districts.
So thinking about how we come up with policies, it's important. What we've discussed is it's important to talk about and think about what the barriers of entries are for those who are most directly impacted, which usually includes rural communities when we're thinking about prison towns. And it's important to create pathways for those communities to self-advocate and have their voices actually be heard. Because as we saw in Susanville and Blythe, there are lots of cases where they want to self-advocate but are consistently ignored, which does not make sense when they're the ones experiencing the harm in the first place, when their prisons close and they lose that source of economic development. And one thing that, at least in my research, I've been looking at is wealth inequality as a common denominator. So I'm going to speed through this a little bit because I know that we're tight on time. But we have seen cases from California to right here locally in Rhode Island where wealth inequality impacts whose voices gets heard. So there was a proposal for another prison to be closed instead that Blythe proposed when they heard that their prison was slated to close when that announcement was made. And this made a lot more sense because the Norco prison was more poorly maintained, it was more expensive to run, it was not up to code, but their proposal was ignored because the CDCR, had already decided that their prison would be closed. And then an example from here in Providence that I heard about from one of the local activists here, Brandon Robinson, is about how when it comes to policy testifying at the State House, while professionals usually have the opportunity to speak first, those with a higher formal education degree are prioritized while, quote, the working person is waiting until 2 a.m., which has a lot of implications for how this state at least values those with direct lived experience and highlights why it's important to uplift their voices especially. Another thing I wanted to highlight that's been key for us is the importance of mixed methods. So even just by comparing the research that we've done together, let alone the entire lab, the combination of quantitative and qualitative has led us to make insights that we would not have been able to otherwise. And yeah, another thing I wanted to emphasize is, again, organizing around the needs of those most impacted. And in Susanville, this has implications for those who were inside the CCC, inside the prison, and outside the prison. So I don't think I have time to go into detail about this, but uplifting the living conditions of those inside through an amicus brief during the Dixie Fire, which was kind of a horrific fire that Susanville experienced, occurred at the same time that those in Susanville were realizing that they also had insufficient resources for the fire department, which is unfortunate, and they had to pull resources from out of state to deal with the Dixie Fire, which is why one of the solutions that we came up with for them specifically was to invest in a fire base, which would provide jobs as well as fill that resource, which leads me to, I guess, the last point I make, which is about how repurposing and upcycling the prison and upcycling the place, making something better out of what the prison was, is not generalizable and has to be specified to the needs of that community.
Great. And I wanted to flag really quick, since we're talking about Providence, if anyone wants to know any more about organizing in Providence around decarceration or around the prison system, you can find me or Sarah at any time. We can either answer your questions or direct you to someone who can. So when we talk about upcycling the place, because we know that the prison boom in rural towns was generated by this demand for prisons, it has to be what we need to curb it by curbing that demand and upcycling these towns in terms of economic development. So this can look a lot of different ways, but mostly it needs to hit on economic stability, social stability, and working with communities. So this can include a broad range of policy solutions, including focusing on broadband infrastructure or investing in renewable energy, transportation. A lot of rural places either have or are in close proximity to beautiful natural resources, and so natural parks are another fantastic public works project. Not always feasible, won't always fill the exact economic footprint in terms of number of jobs, but do tend to have that same sort of stabilizing effect. All right, that is what we have. Thank you very much.
Just need a minute. I have to open up right here. Okay. I don't know how to make this big. Is this fine? Is there a way to make this?
Command L or Control L.
Control L. Okay, thank you. Great. Okay. The clicker? Okay, great. So first of all, I want to thank everyone at the Urban Institute, the Watson Center, specifically Ivy Hunter, Ellen White, Chloe Hamison, that have been amazing to bring us all here today, including myself. And really the logistical aspects of running this type of thing is immense. I've done it. So thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Eason, John Eason, for inviting me here today and, realizing this vision that I've heard about for many years, COVID putting a wrench in this, but thank you so much. So today I'm going to bring in kind of leading from what we've heard about in terms of understanding where the kind of the consequences of this prison boon are kind of shaping out specifically within immigrant detention centers around the United States. So this is a working paper that actually a few of you have seen me present on some preliminary findings of this about a year ago, but we're wrapping it up, so it's exciting to be able to present it today. Relocating the border immigrant detention center placement across the prison boom from about 1980 to 2010. One other thing I'm really excited about being in a space like this, in a very profound interdisciplinary space. I am a sociologist by training, however, I also have a policy degree, and being entrenched in the economics of this, but also there's socio-legal aspects of this, is really an important space to be, right? Having this interdisciplinary conversation is essential to really understanding what is going on with these issues today. Okay, so I like to start this conversation always grounding my work in history. So there is some recent work coming out, and I believe this to be very true, that I start my study in 1980. This is a picture of the Mariel boat lift when the Cuban refugees were leaving Cuba en masse over about a 4-month period. And really sparked a very strong, visceral response here in the United States against the immigrants coming in, and really fueled and began kind of this big wave of increasing immigrant detention around the United States in the 1980s to where kind of we see today, right? With expanding infrastructure, expanding institutional support, funding to support these endeavors. I will be remiss to say that this is a new phenomenon. We have been dealing with this for over a century. A lot of my colleagues, my historians, my friends, have really grounded this conversation, much farther back than 1980. But since 1980, there really has been a fundamental shift in how it's actually shaping and reshaping itself here in the United States. Both within the institution itself, but then communities as well. So my work really centers its focus on describing and understanding how immigrant detention has really become and evolved itself as its own form of punishment, particularly since the 1980s and arguably before then. So just a bit of context: immigration violations in general. And detention prior are really civil matters for the most part, right? These are civil violations; they're not criminal violations in many spaces, and so there are kind of some constitutional limitations around how we understand immigration violations. But as we begin to unfold over the last half century, we're beginning to realize how a lot of these violations are being treated within a more entrenched form of criminal punishment. What I like to describe and understand immigrant detention being is really an extension more recently as a form of the carceral system in the United States. So here I draw on a lot of theories around Foucault's carceral continuum conversation and writings looking at incarceration in prisons in specific as a broader connection, not just as institutions themselves, but really delving deeper within varying levels of state, including towns, counties, and U.S. states as well. And then Heather Schoenfeld's carceral capacity work, which I'm very happy that she's here on the panel with us to have a conversation after we speak, to really understand how the states, the U.S. states, are really building their support and ability to increase carceral capacity in the United States. And of course, immigrant detention increasingly and over time, we're finding very egregious human rights violations happening within these centers. Hernandez and Eason and some co-authors in 2018. Professor Aldana Marquez, who is here with us today, has also written extensively on documenting some of these atrocities within immigrant detention centers and how individuals themselves within these carceral spaces are being subjected to very extreme forms of punishment. So what do we know about immigrant detention within the literature? I know this is a policy conference, and I will get to that, but I do need to kind of help folks understand this particular research project within the larger scope of what we do know about immigrant detention as a form of punishment. So scholars for very long now, over 2 decades, have, for primarily legal scholars, lawyers in the field, have begun to document how immigration law and criminal law have really become much more entwined within both within the legislation itself, within the institutions such as immigrant detention centers, prisons, jails, but then also within the procedural processes, right? How these things are happening and going through the court systems, how individuals are navigating themselves through both immigration legal proceedings as well as criminal legal proceedings, depending on the cases that are at hand. And what we know and how people have named this, right? This is the crimmigration, right, era of the literature. A lot of you, I see you nodding, so you kind of know. So this is very deeply entrenched in the legal doctrine and understanding the law and how legal and the legislation has evolved to have this this new form of crimmigration operating in communities and states today. What we also know about immigrant detention is there is extensive work looking at case and comparative studies, so individuals actually getting access into these facilities. It's very few, it's very hard. I myself, as a graduate student, attempted to, go through the IRB process and try to get into the local immigrant detention center in Dodge County in Wisconsin. And ICE was, a big brick wall there trying to get in. So it's very hard to access these facilities on the inside. There are initiatives that are happening to provide expanded legal services on the inside, where institutions such as the Vera Institute are doing great work to support increasing legal services within these institutions. So there's few but some work on case and comparative studies. There's an extensive body of literature examining the political economy and the historical development of these institutions across time and across place. I listed some of the authors here. And then probably most important for my conversation today is looking at the causes and consequences of this expanding detention center network within the United States. So some of the forefront thinkers on this is Moin Setter. She's actually released a very interesting piece in AJS this year around looking at immigrant detention center immigrant detainment across the United States, and then, of course, Rio and Peacock's series of work around this issue. There are limitations to some of this, and we still don't know a lot about what is happening here. And so what our work is trying to do is really elevate some of this conversation in a distinct and more precise way. So kind of looking at immigrant detention centers and comparing this with prison openings, what this paper is trying to do and what we've been trying to do for a number of years is understand and really begin to document this relationship with immigrant detention center placements and prisons, right? Victoria did a great job of explaining the prison boom, and so we have that here in the orange in terms of, so these are the number of openings, sorry about the labels, on the left, across time, right, since about 1980. So as we see, right, there is the prison boom happening, peaking in the 1980s. And then as we begin, and we've talked about this already, there is a documented prison bust, and we see that happening here in this graph as well. Most interestingly, based on the preliminary data that I'm drawing on, although, again, this is arguably difficult and incomplete in itself, we see evidence of a potential detention center boom, right, or increase, kind of supplanting what we see with this decline in prison buildings over time. And that's the blue bars right there. So what is immigrant detention center placement? I think it's important to understand and really be clear that we're talking about two fundamental different systems here. Prisons, jails are institutions, they're buildings, they're brick and mortar places. Immigrant detention centers are not as easily understood, right? So they can be a mix of standalone ICE facilities and also temporal contracts with existing carceral facilities in themselves. They're typically contractual agreements with ICE and the federal government and local carceral entities to specifically house and detain immigrants. They're mixed-use facilities in many cases. These contracts often detail out per diem costs to house, transport, and manage the security of these immigrant detainees. They're reviewed and approved regularly, typically on a yearly basis with ICE. And these contracts can be signed indefinitely or for a fixed period of time. So this is an example of one of them, just to give you a sense of kind of what they might look like, right? Oops. I have to kind of run a little bit faster. I think I'm a bit slow here. So what is the relationship? My questions here, what is the relationship between places, so towns, with detention centers, and the demographic characteristics of these towns, the economic characteristics, and whether or not these places have an existing prison. So it's important to talk about data here. The data is very difficult to get on this. ICE is not an easy institution to work with, and advocacy organization, Easton has been part of this as well, have been trying over 15 years to get regular data. We're now at that point where ICE is actually publishing this data more regularly, which is great. But this data comes from a FOIA request that coded about 246 facility-level data that we geocoded to the US Census Place, and it does provide year, facility, and contract initiation dates. We use the prison proliferation policy data, sorry, that says at UW-Madison. Sorry about that. And then our decennial census estimates. I'll go real quickly. So I use a cross-sectional rare event logistic regression. Why cross-sectional? You know, a lot of robust studies use longitudinal panel data. I'm using cross-sectional data because I do believe there is very important periods of times at the decades that we need to map out and understand, linking it with policies, linking it with laws, linking with prison building to really see how there has been this dramatic change across decades, right? What is it across the decades that we are, that is changing over time? The N is about 25,000 plus, and this is a model for one of the regression estimates. So again, here we have a nasty little table. The nice thing here is to look at these last two columns, right? The percentage changes from 1980 to 2010. Here we have towns with detention centers and prisons. So obviously there's been dramatic increases in the number of detention centers, and then over 700% increase in places that have a prison and a detention center across the United States. For the economists in the room, you love these types of tables. These are my rare event logistic results. I think, again, I have a lot of noise here, but what we're finding is that there is a positive relationship with prisons over time and increasingly, right? And I'll kind of put these in words later, but we see these towns have more Hispanic populations, greater poverty, although rural towns are not kind of seeing this type of similar trajectory, and it's increasing, right, from 1980 to 2000. I have a lot of noise in the 2010 stats, so I'm a little bit worried about putting those out there. Okay, so policy implications. There's a range, right? First and foremost should always be international policy. A lot of migration is a result of very long-standing policy decisions made by the United States into affected regions, specifically Central and South America, that is really pushing migrants, not just in the Americas, but around the world into the United States. That's creating a demand on these systems. There's a lot of national policy implications that can happen, things like a call to end ICE. We've had very high-profile politicians pushing these agendas, and of course, comprehensive immigration reform. But most importantly, and I will argue, local level responses is kind of where we really need to be entrenched in as we continue these conversations. We can talk about an end to ICE in the dialogue. Here are some images around what this might mean. Comprehensive immigration reform, I'm a big skeptic on this. I know this is where the politicians and our immigrant advocates, so to speak, really want to lay, and this is the answer, right, we hear this often. I'm very skeptical of this. I can talk about more about that, why, in the legislation. But what we do know is CRR legislation has been introduced repeatedly and over time since the early 2000s, and it's only getting worse. So where, I have to wrap this up, but where I find the most exciting and most interesting and the places where the researchers and advocates really need to be spending and focusing their time at is at the subnational level. So here's an example of the recent SB 4 law in Texas, right, that is, hotly being debated right now in public and in the Supreme Court. And we have the sheriff here, Richard Wiles from San Antonio, talking about the challenges his institution specifically will have. A great quote from this article: "They are shifting the cost of the federal issue to local taxpayers," Wiles said, adding that the costs for secure borders should be on every taxpayer in the nation, not just those who live along the border, right? So here we're talking about this is not just a national issue, but really this is entrenched in the local politics around and communities around the country. Another potential policy that I always like to talk about, the criminologists in the room will understand this as alternatives to incarceration, but alternatives to detention is potentially a way to kind of ease the strain of these detention center places around the country. So these are practices that ensure that individuals are not detained for reasons that are related specifically, right, to their migration status. Okay, and I'll end here. This is a map, so you can see and just be, it's kind of hard to see, but the red dots, these are detention centers around, and you can see very clearly, and overlaid with prisons in the black, you can see very clearly that this is obviously not a border issue, but one that's really kind of permeated within and throughout the United States and in our communities. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. How's everyone doing? Yeah. So again, I'm Heather Schoenfeld. I'm an associate professor at Boston University, and I've been studying the problem of mass incarceration for quite a while. What I want to do today is put carceral capacity into a larger context and kind of expand how we're thinking about carceral capacity from where we started here at this panel. And I think hopefully this will relate to the panels that we're going to hear for the rest of the day. So when I began to study the causes of mass incarceration in the US many years ago, my research and the researchers of many others in this room were building on a first generation of studies that examined how shifts in national politics, national economy, and culture led policymakers to respond to crime and people's fear of crime with punitive sanctions and prison. But as the second generation of scholars began digging into more specific histories at the state and local level, we realized we had to look at the decisions that made mass incarceration possible, not just the wider conditions. As I argue in my book, Building the Prison State, in order to funnel millions of people through our criminal legal systems each year, we need certain state capacity, enough police officers, courts, probation offices, prison cells, and so on. As I studied the growth of incarceration, particularly in Florida, I found that before the state could get tough on crime, it invested millions of federal, state, and local dollars into all levels of the criminal legal system, from policing to courts to prisons, mostly between the 1960s and the early 1990s. These were absolutely intentional decisions. And these investments, as we've heard from this panel about the boom in prisons, they didn't just happen in Florida, of course, they happened all over the country. And as Caitlin points out, they did happen at different rates. So we heard how both California and Oklahoma, two states of very different sizes, each built 40 plus prisons, right? So I don't know what Oklahoma is doing with all that prison space. And as Isabel reminds us, at the federal level, at the same time, we invested in immigrant detention centers. So these investments created carceral capacity, what I define in my book as the human, material, and bureaucratic resources dedicated to detecting, apprehending, processing, and punishing those we deem criminal, right? And this, again, there's this blurring of the line between civil and criminal, and we argue that immigrant detention centers and how we're viewing immigrants is through this same lens of criminal. But I want to also expand this idea because it's not just physical resources that we're talking about here. It's not just prisons. It includes things such as bureaucracies, staff and administrative positions, data management systems, protocols for coordination across these systems, and much more, right? We need all of this capacity to do what we're doing now. So we got a big picture from our panel about what this prison boom looked like, and we're starting to get a picture about what the bust looks like. But it's important when we look back at the historical context that we understand who is making these decisions. And importantly, it's in the 1960s and 1970s, we found that it was criminal justice reformers, including progressives, who advocated for many of the initial investments in carceral capacity. These investments were meant to fix what they saw as a broken system. Later, these investments became economic growth and development for rural communities. But we need to look at policymakers, right, to see how this was facilitated. So I want to talk a little bit more about why carceral capacity matters. It matters for not just creating the prison boom, but for sustaining the current system. And Caitlin mentioned how in their data set they find that construction of prisons actually precedes increases of incarceration or incarceration rates. So let's talk a little bit about why that might happen. So first, carceral capacity creates political and economic interests in maintaining the system. These include law enforcement, prison communities, as we've heard here, and the hundreds of thousands of people employed by the system. So we are also now getting a sense of what happens when we take that capacity away and how it may harm or damage schools, kids' education, and so on. So we need to think, though, broadly, not just about these material benefits, but about the cultures that it has created, right? So when we talk about political interests or economic interests, it's not just, I need investments for my school. It's also, people have built their identities, right? People have built their worldviews around prisons and carceral capacity. Second, carceral capacity steers policy solutions to more of the same. So particularly in moments that call for immediate action, like a rise in violent crime, for example, or less immediate things like changes in the economic system. And as Sam and Sarah note, because there's been investments in communities in prisons, there hasn't been investments in other things. It steers so we look to the capacity that's there, right? So policymakers turn to capacity that already exists. In this case, trying to hold on to prisons. But we can also see that we're seeing now sort of a turn back to the tough on crime type of rhetoric and policy, because that's what's there. It's a known capacity, right? And that's very different than, for example, investing in community organizations with less of a known capacity. Even though all the research, of course, shows that this is not what we need to be investing in. So one thing I want to make clear is that decisions to invest in carceral capacity are not the same thing as investments in the things that will reduce crime. So at the same time that we were investing in carceral capacity, we were not investing in things such as education, right? We were not investing in quality health care. We were not investing in other things that are actually known to reduce crime. Okay, so I will quickly get to the end of what I'm going to say. Okay. So for the last 6 years, myself and my co-author, Michael Campbell, have studied attempts to reduce state prison populations in 6 states. And we find that the policies that have the most impact are not alternatives to incarceration, such as diversion programs. They're not reentry programs that are designed to reduce recidivism. What we have concluded is that we simply cannot unravel mass incarceration and address the harms of incarceration by creating new capacities within our criminal legal system, right? The policies that are reducing capacity are policies that simply increase the number of people who are released from prison, reduce the number of people on parole or probation that go back to prison, and shorten prison lengths, right? That's how we get to this bust that we're talking about here. Of course, this creates a tension, right? The tension that was brought up here. So on one hand, we want to reduce capacity. On the other hand, we see that it has negative consequences and increases inequality in certain communities. We also need to think about, as we reduce capacity and reduce spending, what happens to conditions inside prisons. So arguably, our prisons right now are worse off than they were in 1970, when a whole cadre of civil rights lawyers started suing prisons. They are understaffed, they are dangerous, people are not receiving health care, and we need to think about that as well. I'm running out of time, but I just wanted to say that, of course, the question for us is, how do we get there, right? This inertia and these interests are going to continue. And so I hope what we can hear today is not just policy solutions, right, what it is we should be doing, but how it is we can get there. So thank you so much for your time. Okay, yeah, I'm going to take audience questions. Do you want me to sit here? Okay, we have some time for questions.
We have a mic getting passed around.
Over here. Go ahead, you can start if you want.
Thank you so much. This was absolutely fascinating. Thank you. Now that people online can hear me as well. Thank you so much. This was absolutely fascinating. This is, I think, in part a question for Sarah and Sam, because it sounds like you may have been among those who actually talked to folks on the ground defending the residents. So, across the panels, right, we have this economic issue, right, of the investment in the prisons and the importance economically to local communities integrated throughout the ecosystem of those communities. But also, and Heather was hitting on this in her notes at the end, this cultural element around it as well. Identities are wrapped up in it. I was thinking a lot about Paul Willis's Learning to Labor, which had implications for deindustrialization as industrial jobs were shutting down and people were losing their identities and not being sure what to do with it. But I wonder if there's opportunity. I was thinking about one of the quotes from one of the workers who was saying, "I hate my job, but it pays really well." So one of my colleagues, Natasha Frost, has been focusing in recent years. Her early work was all on kind of ending mass incarceration from the perspective of those incarcerated. It's terrible. But her recent work is focused on, it's also terrible to work in prisons. The jobs suck. They really do. A lot of her work these days focuses on the incredibly, shockingly high suicide rates among correctional officers. And when she started focusing on that, she was thinking, well, it's dehumanizing to work in a prison, and that would be that actually wasn't the biggest thing. The biggest thing was the job itself is terrible, right? The hours are really bad. If someone doesn't show up for their next shift because of the security functions of it, you have to stay on, even if you were supposed to pick your kid up at school, right? Even if you'd promised your partner that, you were going to pick them up at school. So people got divorced, whatever. So I'm wondering if you heard any openness, right, to that among people. And again, that one quote was what, gave me hope. That, right, I hate my job, but, right, from, the interviews that you did you feel like there might be an openness to a change in that culture, a change in that identity, if a better economic, model presented itself? So.
Yeah, definitely. Can you all hear me okay? Is that better? Oh, like that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Try it.
I'm just gonna keep talking.
I'm gonna get your hand up.
Oh, okay. Thank you. But I will start to answer and just mention when I took Professor Eason's class last spring, we watched a documentary that was from the perspective of, or focused on a few correctional officers and how they came into the job and how there was a lot of hesitancy around it because it was not something that they wanted to do. They talked a lot about how it put a lot of strain on their relationships, like because you said if there's any sort of incident at the prison, they have to stay and work overtime. They can't be there for the people in their lives and for their communities. Aside from the fact that the work itself is not something that they ever imagined themselves doing, but it's more of a position that they've been forced into. So I do think, especially for folks who were in these towns before the prison was there, they've seen this shift in I guess, attitude of like those in their communities and a shift in their relationships because of, just like the way that reliance has shaped that. I do think that a lot of folks see, they have imaginative like capacity for a world beyond this, because one of the questions that we always ask in our interviews is like, what would you, I can't remember specifically what it was, but it prompted them to like imagine something new for their community without the prison. And a lot of them talked about the things that they have pride in their communities. One of those things being, like we said, like the natural resources, the beauty. That's one of the things that drew a lot of them to the town in the first place. So there is a desire to have the centerpiece of the town, have the town be rooted in something other than the prison. But I think, because of the like current economic reliance, a lot of folks don't see any other sustainable way to do that. I think giving alternatives is helpful for that, and I also have hope that because of the fact that a lot of them don't truly want to be doing this job anyway, at least in my opinion, I think there's hope for something new.
Yes, I have questions for Sam and Sarah as well as for Isabel. So Sam and Sarah, you mentioned that your centroids were based on a 20 to 25 minute drive. And I was wondering how you came up with that number. and whether or not it might be more defensible, for instance, since you're already working with census data, to just get, people's, drive times in those communities and average them as a more precise measure, especially given that you're looking at rural contexts for these prisons. And then Isabel, I had a question, could you talk a little bit more about your findings? Because the figures that were being shown, a lot of the estimates look like they spanned zero, and a number of the comparisons between rural and urban look like they overlapped. And so I was wondering which associations that you were measuring were more meaningful than others.
Yeah, so with the 20 to 25 minute drive times, those are numbers that we came up with working with Dr. Eason. They are a little bit arbitrary, just in terms of sketching out the initial picture of it. I think that refining that with the actual drive times for those communities would be a really helpful thing in the next iteration before we run the analyses. We've been also working with. I didn't get a chance to cover this, but we've also been thinking about a number of other ways to categorize school districts in terms of adding in population centroids instead of drive times, or taking school districts with a certain percentage of the area of the places overlapping with them instead of using drive times. So this was just a sort of a rough preliminary gauge of it, but I really appreciate that contribution, because I would very much like to refine it in that way.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And, I think because of the nature of the conversation, I had to kind of gloss over the findings, right? I think I spent too much time on the actual study and not enough on the policy implications. So thank you for the question. But so yeah, I think definitely the trends are very close to zero, and the ones that I showed really, again, recall this is a decennial cross-sectional analysis, right? So I'm looking basically snapshots in time for those that aren't statistics people. So looking at what's happening in these places in 1980 and how the decade following is predicting some of that. How does it look in 1990? How does it look in 2000? And how does it look in 2010? And what I'm seeing, and you'll see in those couple first graphs, that there are very close to zero in 1980 and 1990, because what we do see is there is a greater increase of immigrant detention center placements, probably into the new century, right, into the 21st century. And so the findings really are pointing toward increasing places with Hispanic Latino populations, increasingly over time. Economically, higher unemployment rates over time. And then the greatest finding, the log total population as well. And then the biggest finding is the prison placement, right? So what we're finding is that there is a very strong predictor of immigrant detention center placement where there's already an existing prison. So that's kind of the concrete, strongest finding I have.
We have a question right down here.
Okay, great. Thank you for really interesting presentations. I wanted to ask specifically about this sort of like rural demand for carceral investment that came up a couple of times. And I guess the idea that we must address that demand was kind of like shocking to me as a thing that we were sort of thinking about. I understand that that is like a consequence of trying to decarcerate, for example, but I'm just curious, like, what is the nature of the standing that these rural communities have to like have that demand be acted on? Or I guess presumably communities where the people who are incarcerated are from also have needs for economic development as well. And so why are we not deploying extreme policing in rural communities and then arresting those people, warehousing their residents in those other communities, and then paying those people to dominate them? So like this is, like the demand is itself not impetus to act. I'm just curious like where the nature of the specific standing that we attribute to these folks is versus like other places with those same concerns, but not the same kind of cultural investment. Thank you.
All right, can we hear me? Awesome. Excellent question. So I think one thing that's worth clarifying is when I refer to local demand for prisons, I'm not thinking of it as demand in terms of demand for bed space, but thinking of it as demand for investment. And I think you're right. And I tell my students all the time, and they get really frustrated with me when I'm like, no, it's both and, right? We need to be able to spend money in both places, right? Both in the places where the prisons are located, where by decreasing carceral capacity, there is some surplus labor, surplus land, these surplus things that people need in order to live functional lives. But we also need to be spending money in the places where folks who are being incarcerated are coming from. And in a world of finite budgets, both and is a hard thing to sell on. And I don't think that it's clear at this point which is first, which is more important, which happens. I think from a social equity perspective, like supporting the folks who would be otherwise incarcerated by creating these alternative programming, which Isabel was talking about, or creating support structures, like really building that infrastructure is necessary prior to thinking about decarceration. One of the things I've been thinking about a lot recently has been the decriminalization of all drug use in Oregon, which is a super interesting, fascinating policy, really like cool experiment, but arguably Oregon was one of the worst places to do it, right? It was second from the bottom in the nation in terms of drug treatment centers, in terms of access to syringe exchange programs and kind of these things that would actually support people. And so my take is always like we need to be thinking 5-10 years in the future. How can we set things up? And perhaps that is, to your point, spending the money in the communities of origin rather than thinking about how to do economic development in prison towns. But thank you for the question.
Can I just add something there? So many of us here have been involved in an organization called Racial Democracy Criminal Justice Network, and it is not by chance that it is called racial democracy, right? So one of the main things that we need to look at is the state of our democracy and who is at the table, right? And so those rural communities have a different place at the table, and depending on the community, right? As John shows us, a lot of those communities are poor. Many of them are majority Black or Latino. But it is very clear, right, that as we were building prisons, what people were doing was explicitly taking people from urban communities and putting them in rural communities. I have a quote in my book from a policymaker who says, this was the deal we came up with. Everybody understood what we were doing, right? This was intentional. And so we have to look at, yes, power dynamics in the policy process. Okay, we had, Nicole has a question.
Hey, this is for Isabel, but also could be any of the panelists. I was in Chicago on the Owl, and I saw this collision of two worlds. One was several homeless people sitting on the Owl and having mental health episodes, like screaming at the top of their lungs and swearing. And at the exact time the doors opened on the Owl, a family, someone who, an immigrant that was just kind of placed in Chicago, was there, father and son. The child was terrified. He was like 4 years old. He was like, you could see him, and the dad was like, it's okay, they were selling candy. These are people that would have been in detention, and now we've in some ways made a child and a dad homeless in Chicago in like the brutal cold. I've seen it in jails where they make you free, but they punish you through freedom. No coats, get jumped, all these other things. And so I guess there's something so terrible about immigrant detention, but the option of like dumping families on like city streets with nothing. I mean, I had not seen it in Chicago because I hadn't been back. So in your policy solutions, can we talk a little bit about that? Because when we do release people, there is a particular cruelty in that release. Even wrongfully convicted people get no resources to reintegrate. Professor Miller right now writes about this beautifully, right? There's a cruelty in the freedom. So I'm wondering, can we talk a little bit about that? Because
Yeah, we can
They're
talk
terrible
about it,
resources,
but
but
this,
homelessness is terrible.
so this is and I knew this question was going to come up, and this is a very complicated issue, and there's no really good policy answer. I think a lot of the answers are pointing to action on the federal government, and I agree, that definitely has to happen. But I also think, there is a tremendous local response that needs to be put in place, not just at governmental local levels, but also community level. It is a tragedy, right? And I'm from Chicago, and I talk to people in Chicago now, and it's creating divisions in places, in conversations that we've tried to dismantle for decades, and now it's creating these huge problems, like amongst community members to address what's going on with these very precarious populations, unhoused immigrant populations that are being unprepared and dumped, right? Most because of decisions made by southern border states to make the northern states pay, right, or deal with the problems without preparing them, right? So I believe there has to be much more coordination locally. There has to be much more coordination across states, so that when people do get moved up to places like Chicago from places that are warmer, they're prepared. So I work with some community-based organizations in Chicago who meet people at the bus stops, for example, right, and they come off and they have signals. People come off without shoelaces, or they don't come with belts, or they come in shorts. So they're trained to kind of meet people as they arrive. I think some of these coordinated efforts are very important and essential, because it's not enough for the government to step in and fix it all, right? We do need community-based organizations. We need faith-based organizations that have a history in doing this work, and frankly I don't see really stepping up in the way that they need to do in places like Chicago. So it's a complicated issue. It's not something that's easily answered in 2 minutes today. But it's something that I believe has to be not just the federal or the state or the government, but a really coordinated effort across all of these institutions.
Well, I'm told we need to wrap it up. So I just want to give a hand to our panelists. Thank you so much.